morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Coffee with Sam and Brad session. You're not going to hear a great deal from Brad and I today, this being very much a specialist topic. But we wanted to give you some insights. As I'm sure many of you who have joined today will be aware, the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, or the DTIC, published draft statement 400 of 2026 for public commentary earlier this year. And while the comment period has passed and we as the FIA have made a submission, we believe that it's really important that our members are informed of what these proposals are and what they mean. Because the draft proposes significant amendments to the General Codes of Good Practice governing enterprise and supplier development and preferential procurement under BBBE, and the implications for our members, the majority of whom are small and medium-sized enterprises operating under the general codes, are far-reaching. Key among the proposals is the introduction of a transformation fund as an alternative to existing ESD contributions, carrying 20 weighting points at 3% of NPAT, alongside material changes to preferential procurement targets and points allocations. These amendments raise serious questions about commercial feasibility, internal consistency with the Transformation Fund's own stated objectives, and potential conflicts of interest within the regulatory architecture. Given the complexity of these proposals and the importance of well-informed member submissions ahead of the comment deadline, as I say, we have made that submission. We are delighted to have with us today someone who brings exceptional depth of expertise to this topic. Evan Jones is the founder of Inyosi Empowerment, a leading enterprise and supply development specialist. He has built over more than a decade into a team of 25 people with a well-established ESD fund offering. Evan qualified as a chartered accountant after completing his articles at PricewaterhouseCoopers in 1995 and went on to spend nearly 30 years in executive roles within the asset management industry, including as head of product and business development at Cadis Asset Management. He holds a BCom Honours in Accounting and an LLB from WITS, an LLM from UCT, and is a CFA charter holder, a combination that brings both the legal and financial lens that these amendments demand. Please join me in welcoming Evan to our Coffee with Sam and Brad today. Evan, over to you.
Good. That's quite a lengthy intro. Thanks very much. And you almost covered all of the topics that I'm going to get to, but yeah, thanks very much. Obviously, for those of you, I mean, you're welcome to go and have a look. Our website is inyosi.co.za. Inyosi is the Nguni word for the honeybee, and it's a bit of a play on BEE, as well as I'm an amateur beekeeper. So it's something that's close to my heart. What I'm going to try and do, and I just first want to check, just confirm that you can see the presentation. I'm just checking with my team.
Okay, Evan.
Yeah, great. As per the introduction, it's quite important to understand the regulatory framework that gave rise to the proposed changes, because when you're analyzing the changes, you need to see, I think it's important from a regulatory perspective to understand whether, first of all, whether there's an issue, and secondly, if there is an issue, whether the changes amend or fix that issue. So, and obviously, because the BEE codes affect so many businesses and so many people, it's likely that any changes are going to be highly contested, very contentious, etc. So, so without further ado, I'm going to just try and jump into trying to see why I can't go. Okay. So what happened? The first inkling that there was around what is the amendments that followed was that the DTI published something which was called the Draft Transformation Fund Concept Document, and they published that in March 2025. And it's quite a lengthy document, but if you go and read through it, In the objectives, they said that they wanted to promote economic transformation, to enable meaningful participation of Black people in the economy. They wanted to improve access to funding for majority Black-owned and controlled enterprise. And you'll see it is important. I've highlighted these words, specifically majority, and you'll see why when we get to preferential procurement, because so they're saying they want to improve access to funding for majority Black-owned and controlled enterprises. They want to empower and support majority Black-owned and controlled enterprises participating in value change across key sectors. And they want to mobilize financial resources from the private and public sector using BEE legislation. So those were the objectives. The transformation, if you then look at that, if you just go look at the wording, you'll see that they twice refer to majority Black-owned and controlled enterprises. They refer to improve majority Black-owned enterprises access to funding and support majority Black-owned enterprises in value chains across key sectors. So when you read that, you should be getting a perspective that the DTIC believes that they need to deepen or strengthen the ability for majority Black-owned businesses to get into the value chains, to be funded to get into the value chains of industry. Okay, so that's high level, takeaway from that. Further in the fund concept document in section 2.4, they make a number of claims. So this is back in March. I'm still just giving the history. They state that ownership and control of most enterprises is mostly in the hand of the minority. Majority of Black people are still excluded from mainstream economy. SMME sector is largely underserviced and underfunded. And ESD contributions do not seem to have the anticipated impact on marginalized groups. Now, again, it's quite interesting to me when I was analyzing this, and obviously I was then looking backwards. I received the legislative proposed amendments, and I was going back in time to see what they were saying. And it seems quite interesting that the last point, the enterprise and supply development contributions, do not seem to have had the anticipated impact on marginalized groups. And that wording is actually quite weak, right? So they're not unequivocal about it. They're vacillating a little bit. They then go on to state, and this is essentially the central thesis for what they're proposing, is they believe that there's a strong rationale for the creation of an aggregated fund, such as a transformation fund, to address these issues in a coordinated and impactful manner. The fund would aggregate resources from various stakeholders, including government, corporate, and other entities committed to transformation, dedicated to supporting majority Black-owned, importantly, wording again, majority Black-owned businesses, facilitating their growth and driving broad-based economic empowerment. This fund aims to provide critical financing, mentorship, and business development support, focusing on sectors and enterprises in most in need of transformation. Additionally, and crucially here, they say it would promote greater compliance with BEE requirements. So when I go through the section related to enterprise and supply development, I'll come back to the greater compliance, and that would create a more sustainable, inclusive economic ecosystem, ultimately contributing to redressing, etc. So this is difficult to see now, but you'll actually, I'll try and unpick this as we go through it. But when we go through the amendments, you'll see that the proposed amendments actually appear to reduce the Transformations Fund's obligational transparency, and also it reduces any measures entities' BEE compliance burden. And it's very difficult to reconcile this with the greater compliance with BEE requirements. But I'll unpack that a bit later when we get to it. Then in that Transformation Fund concept document, the data that they relied on was from a BEE transformation report published in 2022. And in 2022, I just want to see if I bring up my laser point here. In 2022, with the laser point, I can't can't actually use. Okay. So I just want to point to enterprise and supply development. So in the 2022 report, they showed the average score of companies who submitted BE certificates or affidavits, and they showed the different categories. Some of you hopefully are aware there are 5 different what are called elements. There's ownership, management, control, skills development, enterprise and supply development, and socioeconomic development. And they showed this first table. And you can see these percentages. Now the percentages they're a little bit difficult to follow because there's just lots of percentages and stuff. So what I did is I just created in the table below a relative ranking. So I've highlighted the enterprise and supply development. And all that I did is in Excel, you can do a relative ranking. And what it does, you can see if you look above that socioeconomic development in 2017 is 88%. It's the leading, it's the best performer. So it's got rank 1. And then you can see enterprise supply development is 44%. It is second. Management and control is 42%. And the last one is skills development. And you can see that that's ranked 4th in 2017. So what's quite interesting is that if you then do an analysis, so if you go back to the 2025 fund concept, essentially as a basis for the transformation fund, the DTIC went and looked at this report, okay, and out of this report, they picked the problem child as being enterprise and supply development because that's where the almost 99% of the changes came. And so they said enterprise and supply development is the problem child here. And what I'm saying is that it's quite interesting to me that they chose that because if you look, and I'm just going to get to my laser pointer here, if you look at these rankings here, you can see that prior to COVID, actually enterprise and supply development was the second best performing element. Admittedly, during and immediately post-COVID, it slumped to 5th. Okay, but again, you can also see that it suffered the biggest slump from 61 to 46%, but then it also had the biggest improvement again the following year. So you can see that it was consistently good, had a really bad a year in 2021, which was COVID related, and post-COVID it started recovering. So what I found interesting is that the slump could have been triggered as a post-COVID coping mechanism. It could have been a result from economic downturn. As I said, this already had the single biggest gain. The gaps between all elements other than socioeconomic development is consistent through time. So you can see that there's a lot of consistency across the elements. And then a fundamental question that I would have, and I suspect at some point will need to be answered, is if in 2026, you are deciding to put out amending legislation and you're basing it on data up until 2022, surely, and you can see that there's this significant and almost inexplicable slump, and then a slight, well, actually quite a strong bounce thereafter. Why is there not more data? So, why haven't they provided data or asked this data was produced by the BE Commission? Where's the 2023 data? Where's the 24 data? Where's the 25 data? And if we're publishing in 26, is there any data that we can incorporate from 26? And I think an important thing to remember for those of you who aren't aware, enterprise and supply development is a little bit of a misnomer because it actually covers 3 distinct aspects. It covers preferential procurement, enterprise development, and supply development. So there's no granularity within, if, and I'm not saying this is the case, but if this is the problem, they haven't said actually the problem is in enterprise and supply development, which we acknowledge is a combination of preferential procurement, enterprise development, supply development. And within that, the problem is actually in preferential procurement, or the problem is in enterprise development, or it's in supply development, or it's in all three. There's no granularity to that. So, and then the final thing, which is very vexing, is that there's no clarity, and I'm fairly sure that this data excludes any government sector BEE compliance. So if you go and do a search, you can, if you want to look at almost any medium to large company, if you type the company's name and you type BEE, you typically are going to find their BEE certificate. You're going to find what their scoring is. You do the same for almost, I've done it. There's almost, in fact, I haven't yet found a single public sector certificate or ranking or rating or anything. So there's complete obscurity around public sector, but private sector is the one that's being judged. But this economy has got an enormous public sector component. And so one of the aspects that I think will also be questioned at some point is, is this a composite picture? Is it both public and private? And if it is public and private, what is the granularity? What is the breakdown of these of this suggested shortfalls? Because it could be, if these are the numbers, it could be that this fall happened in the public sector in 2021. So there's a lot of information there that needs to be checked. Just pulling out of that same, so again, I'm going back to the bedrock for the Transformation Fund. I'm going back to the Transformation Report of 2022. And this is these are extracts that I've taken directly out of that same report. And you can see they make the same point, the element registered. So this is enterprise supply development, registered steady progress from an average of 44 to 55 in 2022. And then, you know, it says the performance against the 6-year average, and they essentially are saying, if you look below, figure 20 compares the 2022 55% with a 54% 6-year average. So what they're saying I mean, you know, there's lies and damn statistics. You can. So they've taken 6 years worth of data, and they said that averages 55%, and yet the 2022 performance is 54%. Now, even this picture, if you look at this picture, you know, there's a 1 percentage point between these two, and yet it looks like there's a, you know, it's a country mile between them. So so even if you accept that 54% is you know, in line with the previous 6 years and hasn't really improved, what's very interesting, so I was saying, okay, I'm assuming that this data is private sector data, right? So these are what private sector companies are doing, and they've achieved just over half compliance, let's say 54, 55%. I then said, okay, well, where can I see how public sector is faring generally? So this is the scorecard for how we're doing with enterprise supply development, and this is given as a rationale for the Transformation Fund. This is given as a reason for why we need to fix things. So let's have a look at somewhere else where we can see public sector performance. And you probably all know that the Auditor General publishes a report annually, and they score municipality, all the municipalities. And if you look on page 25 of the Auditor General report for the years 2023 to 2024, only 41 out of 257 have clean audits. So that's just 16%. So my simple point here is that obviously when one looks at averages and when one looks at compliance, etc., one automatically expects or hopes for higher levels of compliance, 60, 70%, etc. But one must be careful when looking at how this is just one component of what private sector companies do. And oh goodness, sorry. And so to pour scorn on a 55% performance, it should be evaluated in the context. And unfortunately, we don't have any information for how there's no granularity between private and public sector performance. So it's not possible to try and say, well, this 54% is terrible or 55% is terrible, because public sector enterprise and supply development is at 80%, for example. There isn't that level of detail. And then the final point I'm going to make here is that in that 2022 report, which is relied upon for the concept document that was published by the DTI in 2025, the following caution was stated. Okay, so they do talk about this average, and performance shows no significant improvement. So they're basically saying for 6 years it's flatlining, and this needs to be examined further. And then they say, nevertheless, caution must be exercised not to interpret underlying data as industry trends due to insufficient data. So even in the original report, they acknowledge that further data should be obtained before making a final decision. And obviously, when the March 2025 concept document was released, there's no further data provided. What I'm going to do now, so that's some of the background, and that background leads us into the proposed changes. And you'll recall that I made quite a meal of majority black owned, because it's very pertinent to some of the more significant changes in preferential procurement. Now, I must caution that we are an enterprise and supply development specialist. We don't get involved in preferential procurement. So I've put it together based on my understanding and dealing with various consultants that we work with. It's not my area of speciality, but I think when you read it, you'll see the changes and the impact, because you can even in your own business, you can just consider the impact if you had to comply with these changes. So one of the first new clauses is they've introduced procurement spend from 100% black-owned QSE. And this amounts to, sorry, I'm just going to close this here, it's in the way for me. This amounts to 2% and 2 points and 15% of procurement spend. So what they're saying is this amendment will require companies to spend, they can earn 2 points, and obviously you can earn between 0 and 2 points. And you can earn that by spending 15% of your procurement on 100% black-owned QSEs. Now, for me, this is very odd. If you look at the 2025 transformation document, they refer to majority black-owned enterprise. Now, majority black-owned is 50% plus 1 vote. That's what majority black-owned means. And requiring that 100% black-owned QSEs fulfill 15% of procurement is likely to be practically unattainable for most measured entities. And you can figure that, you can just think about it in the context of your own business. Then, not only that, the next, I've picked the I's out of the clauses. Clause 2.1.5, they've introduced. Now they're saying procurement spend from 100 black-owned EMEs. I presume all of you know the difference between EME and a QSE. If you don't, an EME has turnover of 10 million rand, so up to 10 million, and a QSE has a maximum turnover of 50 million rand. And so what they're saying is that companies, corporate, any BEE complying corporate, must spend 15% of their procurement to obtain 2 points from 100% black-owned EMEs. Again, the focus on the right, that focus on 100% black ownership is inconsistent with the concept document's reference to majority black-owned enterprises. The 15% procurement spend threshold for 100% black-owned EMEs is practically and realistically unattainable. Now, the reason why I say that is if you take, so in some of you may be familiar that, these changes are to the generic codes only. There are also sector-specific codes. In some of the sector-specific codes, they've introduced changes which sometimes are quite good, sometimes not so good. But one of the really good sector codes is the construction sector code. Because in the construction sector code, they recognize that, generally speaking, smaller companies will procure from other smaller companies, and really big companies will procure from really big suppliers. And that makes sense. If you're a corner cafe, you can afford to actually, that's a bad example because you get most of your foodstuffs from let's just say you're running a smallish business, a home office type thing. You're quite happy to go on to Takealot, buy whatever you need. You can get the sandwich lady in, in a micro enterprise. You will buy from other micro enterprises, and you will buy from other businesses that are easy to buy from. If you are a Nestle or an Engen or a Worksmans or any big company, you're going to have very sophisticated supplier take-on processes, and those supplier take-on processes are onerous. And so when you bring on a supplier, it's likely that you're going to want a supplier that can fulfill all your needs. And for a big company like Nestle, for example, their minimum order might be more than the turnover of an EME. So if their order might be a couple of million. And so if you look at their total purchases, right, or procurement, how many one needs to do the maths to figure out if you've got a 2 or 3 billion rand procurement spend. Let's just say 1 billion rand, and you need to procure 15% of that. That's 150 million rand. And you can only procure that from companies with a turnover of 10 million rand. And you're not going to be their only client. Let's say it's 5 million rand. That's like, I don't know, I think that's 50, that alone, that example, I think is 50 EMEs, just one company. So the chance of any company achieving this is highly unlikely, and it's practically and realistically unattainable. Clause 2.1.6, procurement spend from 51 to 99% black-owned EMEs, 3 points and 25% of procurement spend. Previously, 51 to 99. Now this, bear in mind, if you remember the wording that I spoke about, majority black-owned companies. Now these are majority black-owned. They're from 51% to 99. And the only reason why it's to 99 is because they've now brought in this 100%. But they 51% or more, let's say, okay? That you get 3 points at 25 procurement. Now it used to be 11 points and 50% of procurement spend. So the transformation fund concept document specifically raised concerns around majority black-owned companies' access to markets and basically getting a bigger slug of the South African market. And the one amendment, clause 2.1.6, removes it reduces the procurement spend from 50% before to 25%, and it reduces the points from 11 points down to 3 points. And it almost cuts against what they were saying. So by excluding entities on the right with any level of black ownership and limiting the clause to 51 to 99, the scope of the provision has been significantly narrowed. Reduction in procurement spend from 50% to 25% is also not proportionate to the reduction in points from 11 to 3. So if for example, you could get your mind around the fact that you could somehow find some consistency with what they were saying about majority black owned, which you can't, but if you could, how do you equate a reduction in procurement spend from 50 to 25, which is half, by cutting the points from 11 to 3, which is about 3/4? It just doesn't make sense. The maths doesn't even make sense. Clause 2.1.7, procurement spend from 100% black-owned suppliers, 7 points and 25% of procurement spend. So again, the focus on 100% black ownership is inconsistent with the fund concept document. So this again, so this 100% black owned suppliers is obviously could be, it doesn't have to be EME or QSEs, it can be bigger companies, right? So, but the problem here is that they're saying, okay, they want 100% black owned supply. So these are now large black owned companies. And you know, I'm sure all of you are over the last 2 years have been very involved with the your FICA, with the FIC being very vocal in making sure that every accountable institution reports FICA. What we found at Inyosi, and we have a large corporate investor base, we've got almost 600 investors. I was personally staggered at the level of shareholder breadth in every company that invests within Inyosi, maybe with the sole exception of our international multinationals. We've got a couple of international multinational corporations, and most of them are wholly owned by the international parent. But for the rest, in South Africa, it would appear to me that as your company grows, your level of shareholder, the extent of your shareholders grow. Because if you want access to markets, if you want to get into a new area, if you want new clients, often you have to partner with someone who wants equity in your business. And so it's very small companies. When you start your own company, or you and your wife, or you and a friend, it's quite easy to see how very small companies have 100% ownership in any one category. You know, it's either owned by one person or by, 100% black owned, etc. But as a company grows, it becomes less and less likely that ownership remains as concentrated. And certainly from what we can see with our own client base, they have significantly spread shareholding. So the 100% black-owned suppliers, again, is unlikely given the shareholder nature of South African corporates that we're seeing. 2.1.9, procurement spend from 100% black woman-owned businesses, 3 points and 12% of procurement spend. Now, again, the focus on black woman ownership is inconsistent with majority. Obviously, requiring 100% black-owned women to fulfill 12% of procurement spend is practically and realistically unattainable. So this is a common, obviously, I think it is important that female ownership is encouraged, but 100% black woman ownership, I don't believe is practical. I just don't think it's realistic. And then 2.1% procurement spend from 100% designated group-owned businesses, 2 points and 10% of procurement spend. Now, so you need to know that designated groups is youth, it's rural, it's unemployed, it's military veterans, and it's people with disabilities. That's what's covered by designated groups. So let's run through that. Okay, firstly, youth are not likely to have I mean, obviously you do get some young people who start businesses, and but those businesses then take time to get off and to become realistic suppliers to corporates. So youth you can have, but it's quite rare that you would have a youth-owned business that's a significant supplier. Rural is also difficult to see how a business outside of the urban areas or owned by shareholders outside of the urban areas is going to supply businesses which are largely confined to urban areas. Okay, so that also doesn't make sense. Then there's unemployed, clearly unemployed. If you're unemployed, it's likely that you're not, you can't be unemployed and be a share. Well, you theoretically can, but in all likelihood not. So you're left with military veterans and people with disabilities. Now, to have them own any one of those, so any designated group, own 100% of a business also doesn't make sense. So it's just, again, it's almost as if someone doesn't really, they almost don't have a clear view on what they're trying to do. So anyway, so I just find the 100% designated group is inconsistent with the concept document's reference to majority black ownership. And because of who they include, requiring 100% is likely then to be persons with disabilities. If you go through that whole group of 5 different parties, and a company to be owned exclusively by persons with disabilities to be a major supplier into corporates is is not a very realistic prospect, in my view. So in summary, on the preferential procurement, proposed changes have far-reaching implications for measured entity scorecards. The changes do not support the objectives of the Transformations Fund as set out in the concept document. The changes to target percentages and points allocation appear arbitrary. Attaining preferential procurement and bonus points appear to have deliberately been made difficult or impossible to achieve with little regard to commercial reality. And I think this is a very crucial point, and you will know this in your own, because of your own FICA, if you're dealing with corporates, you will know that the shareholding of corporates generally is complex. And so requiring or attaining 100% of any specific designation, whether it's black owned, black woman owned, whatever, designated group owned, etc., is very unlikely. It's likely for very small companies, but once you grow, very, very unlikely. Okay, now I'm going to move on quickly. I see we've got about 20 minutes left to enterprise and supply development. So I'm going to read you the current enterprise and supplier development position. Okay, this is what INYORCI operates under. And hopefully you all understand some of the wording, but in essence, a contribution, an enterprise and supply development contribution, there are 23 different ways in which a company can make these contributions. So a company is called a measured entity in the codes. And one of those, so a contribution, enterprise and supply development contribution, includes a payment made by the measured entity to a suitably qualified and experienced third party to perform enterprise and supplier development on the measured entity's behalf. So within the codes, they already acknowledge that a measured entity, any company, can find like INYORCI and can ask them to do their enterprise and supply development. That's what we do. So we've got close to somewhere between 550 and 600 corporates who've invested with us, and we go and lend to black-owned businesses, and we've been doing that since 2012 on our clients' behalf. Now, if you read this wording, nowhere in the wording does it say a suitably qualified private sector party or a suitably qualified public sector party. So it doesn't discriminate or prefer any sector. And so both private or public third parties can and do perform this role. So moving on then, if you go and look at the National Empowerment Fund integrated report, you will see this is I'll circulate that if you want a bit later, but you will see that since 2012, the NEF has had and offered an enterprise and supplier development fund. So it is a public sector fund, and it's been doing this since 2012. Okay, and they've published on this, probably difficult for you to read, but in essence, this sets out what they've been doing in enterprise and supply development. So I'll just read from this. Let me just show you where I'm reading from here. I'm reading this section over here. This opportunity enables private sector companies to make their enterprise development ED and supply development SD contribution to the NEF's Enterprise and Supply Development Fund, the NEF ESD fund. So what I'm saying is that the existing regulations before the changes already allowed for a public and for any suitably experienced and qualified third party. It didn't matter whether they are public or private sector. So the NEF already offers a public sector fund. The fund's been in existence since 2012. It is currently one of the largest third-party facilitators, with, according to them, around in the last paragraph at the bottom here, it's about 3 billion rand in assets under management. According to the NEF, it has both public and private sector investors. The DTRC, I just wanted to make that final point. If you look at the bottom, I'm going to point again with my pointer here. This is a organogram. It's a picture or a pictorial organogram from the DTRC, and it's got all the different entities that fall under the DTRC, some of which you probably didn't know, but I didn't know either. So the CIPC, the Company and Intellectual Property Commission, falls under them. The Competition Commission, you know, that's been renamed from the DTR to the DTRC, so it includes the Competition Commission, the IDC, etc. But importantly, it's also got SANAS, and somewhere in here, it's got the BE Commissioner. I don't know where it is. One of these over here is the BE Commissioner. Can't find it right now, but it includes the BE Commissioner. So you can take my word for it. It includes the BE Commissioner. And so what's interesting is that, so, and the NEF. Here's the NEF on the left-hand side here. So they are publishing, the DTIC is publishing legislation where it is drafting the legislation, it is offering a third-party fund, and it is regulating the codes via SANAS. SANAS is the body that oversees all of the verification agents. So you've got judge, jury, and executioner all wrapped up in one. So let's look at what the changes are that they're saying. So they've created a new contribution. So if you remember from the original contribution, one of them, so there are 23 different ways in which you can earn enterprise and supply development points. They've added a new one, and they're saying you can make a contribution to the transformation fund, and that's for 20 points, and it's 3% of NetPat. And it's very interesting that this contribution, there is, I'm just going to take my pointer away here. There's no distinction between enterprise and supply development. They're just saying, look, you can either do enterprise and supply development like you were doing, or you can make a single contribution to the transformation fund. Okay, so basically they are removing any distinction between enterprise and supply development. They're just offering this as another alternative. And in the wording, although there is some debate about this, it appears that the measured entity must choose between making a contribution to the transformation fund or undertaking enterprise and supply development. It's not and. You can't do some of the one and some of the other. The current enterprise and supply development only earns 15 points, but they've made a contribution to the transformation fund 20 points. So you get more points if you contribute to the transformation fund. And we believe that that's anti-competitive. And in the codes, in the amendments, they talk about a needs analysis. But if you're making a contribution to a fund and you've no idea what that money is going to be used for, I'll talk a little bit about the needs analysis. But essentially what the needs analysis does is it takes the measured entity. Measured entity finds an enterprise and supply development beneficiary and says, what would you like me to do? How can I help? Oh, you need a loan, or you need a grant, or you need assistance. It develops out a needs analysis, and then it responds to that needs analysis. Now, it is clear from the wording that a needs analysis is required for the transformation fund, but you have no idea what the money is going to be used for because it's completely opaque. And then I've already made the point that they fall under the transformation fund and SANAS fall under the DTIC. There's a massive conflict between being player and referee. And then it's quite interesting about the expertise within the DTI. If you go and look at the the performance of the NEF, you will see that they've suffered almost 50% losses in their loan books over in that same report that I pulled out, the integrated report. Then the next thing that they've done is they've changed the graduation. There are 2 bonus points: graduation and job creation. And graduation, they're saying that a recipient of enterprise and supply development contribution and or 100% black-owned EME or QSE and a first-time supplier that has a minimum 3-year contract. So they're saying if you want a bonus point for graduation, and graduation is you have a business that is an enterprise development beneficiary and you make it a supplier of yours. And so in the past, it used to be that you graduate an enterprise development to a supply development beneficiary. Now they're saying that they must be a recipient of enterprise and supply development contribution and or 100% black owned, again, bringing in the 100%, and it must be a first supplier, and it must have a minimum 3-year contract. Now, out of all of those, I do think the minimum 3-year contract is a good idea personally, because I do think you want to give businesses that you graduate into your supply chain a longer runway. So I agree with that. The rest of it, I struggle to understand. So why does it have to be 100% black ownership? It doesn't tie into the concept document because they spoke about majority black owned. And then job creation. Now, hopefully, regardless of whatever you think about BEE, etc., or about the codes, there's one thing we should easily, every single person on this call should easily be able to agree on, and that is that jobs and job creation is probably South Africa's single biggest issue. If we can create more jobs, a lot of the other issues will start to fall by the wayside. And so the original wording in the existing codes before the amendment or before the proposed amendment was that you would get a bonus point for any job created as a result of any enterprise or supply development activity. I think that was the exact wording. They've changed that to say a job creation is average turnover and job creation growth of at least 10% per annum for, and I'm sorry, this is not my bad writing. This is the exact wording, okay? So of at least 10% per annum for periods, so it's not even, it doesn't even have the correct syntax or grammar or anything, of 3-year contract of all onboarded first-time suppliers. So here we have probably South Africa's single biggest challenge, and they are conflating turnover and job creation. They are putting a minimum growth of 10% per annum. They're putting a minimum term of a 3-year contract, and they're requiring it to be from an onboarded first-time supplier. Now, what this means is that any other job, a job from an enterprise development beneficiary, because a supplier, if you don't know, you can't be an enterprise and a supplier development. You either, if you're a supplier, then you can't be enterprise development. Enterprise development is any black-owned company out there that is not connected to your business. A supplier development is to a supplier of your business. So they've already removed 50% of the market by talking about a supplier. Then they want first-time suppliers. Then they want a 3-year contract. This is, in my mind, what does average turnover have to do with job creation? Why 10% on average? How is it measured? So typically you get, if you have an enterprise or supply development beneficiary that you've given a contribution to in whatever form, and they create a job, then you get job creation bonus point currently. Under this garbage that they've written or word salad that they've written, how do you measure it? Do you get it in the first year and you hope that there's going to be average growth? If there is 10% growth in the first year and you get you meet all the other stuff, if there is average growth of jobs and of turnover in the first year and you get the job creation point, but the next year there's not. So now you don't have the average for 2 years. What do you do then? What if you get 2 years with average of 10% and then the third year there's not? Then your average drops again. What happens then? It just honestly makes no sense. And then why from first-time suppliers? Why are you mixing suppliers and first-time and jobs, etc.? Why only suppliers? There should be any ESD counterparty. And looking at this, because the way the transformation fund is crafted, it looks highly unlikely that transformation contributions will earn any bonus points, because the transformation, you will see, which I'll get to, is a grant to the transformation fund, and then you know nothing about what happens to that grant. Okay, so then the needs analysis. We are getting towards the end of the presentation. They've introduced wording to try and put some. I'm going to hope that they were trying to put some clarity around what a needs analysis should include. And where I put square brackets, I just put it in there to make it read, because I've extracted it from the legislation. So a contributor, measured entities are required to submit a needs analysis, great, with performance metrics and with outcomes and outputs such as turnover growth, job growth, increased access to local and international markets, increase in profitability, greater innovation, annual monitoring and evaluation report to the BEE authorities, inclusive of the verification agency, to verify their contribution and impact of beneficiaries to ensure compliance with the ESG objectives. So when we analyze that, it's very difficult to understand the logic behind this amendment. So not only is this required for any enterprise supply development contribution, it's also required for a transformation fund. But with the transformation fund, you're making a grant to this fund. You have no idea what that's going to be used on. So how do you know what turnover growth, what job growth, what increase to local and international markets is going to happen from your grant? So it's very difficult to see how the transformation fund will provide this information, and it's very difficult. I do think that the process we follow with all of our beneficiaries is to figure out what it is that they need and then to try and assist them. And so that makes sense. You don't want to be just handing out money or doing something that you want that's convenient for you but not for the beneficiary. But the way they've done this, I don't think really helps or takes that much further. For normal ESD counterparties, then this level of detail seems excessive or unlikely. And then getting towards the close, there's something called the Annexure 400, that's the benefit factor matrix. So as I indicated, there are currently 23 different ways in which you can make a enterprise supply development contribution. You can make a grant, you can make a loan, you can make an investment, you can assist with services, you can make all sorts of things. And they've added a grant contribution, which is a performance-based payment linked to needs analysis of the beneficiary. So they've clarified that any grant that you make must be a performance-based payment linked to the needs analysis of the beneficiaries. Now, the problem with this is generally a grant is first of all, any contribution must have a needs analysis. And what is a performance-based grant? Because a grant normally is, something without any corresponding obligation. Direct costs have been narrowed to supporting cost of equipment and tools of trade, excluding derived benefit for the measured entity. No one really knows what that means, but this is the problem. So direct cost is one of the contributions. And this has been narrowed to the cost of equipment and tools of trade. Now, that works fine if you're in a physical industry. So if you are a plumber and you give some plumbing tools to a black-owned plumber that you want to support, okay? So that would fit clearly into supporting cost of equipment and tools. But if you're an auditor or a lawyer or any professional or services business, then you can't give any direct costs because it's limited to supporting the cost of equipment and tools of trade. And quite frankly, it's quite unclear, especially the second part, excluding derived benefit for the measured entity. It's quite unclear what mischief they are trying to remedy with this change. So the transformation fund contribution, so the only way that you can make a contribution to the transformation fund is via a grant, okay? And it gets 100% weighting. So that's consistent with every other grant. So there's what's interesting here is that the transformation grant contribution just says full grant amount. But if you look at one above, any other grant says a grant contribution and in brackets, performance-based payment linked to needs analysis of the beneficiaries. Now, they've already said in a different section that the transformation fund must comply with the needs analysis. But in this benefit factor matrix, they distinguish between a normal grant, which you require performance-based payment linked to needs analysis, with a transformation grant, and they seemingly have no requirement for performance-based payment linked to a needs analysis. However, the needs analysis, as I've said, is required anyway. So it's a bit unclear why it's required in one section and not in another. And in fact, it's very strange that because grants are there anyway, why you need the transformation grant. And then why is this not a normal grant contribution? So they could have said a grant contribution in brackets, including transformation grant. And then interest and standard loans need to have an acceptable standard repayment amortization schedule and duration, not applicable to the transformation fund. Well, we know the transformation fund is a grant only. And this tried to address issues where companies made a loan to a beneficiary and never had a maturity term on that. So they just want a maturity term and repayment schedule. And I think that that's fine. Obviously, what is a standard? What is standard? Acceptable standard repayment schedule? What does the word mean? Standard. And what if the bullet what if the loan is a bullet loan and non-amortizing? So a bullet loan is I lend you 100 Rand for 3 years, and in 3 years' time you repay me. And amortizing is I lend you 100 Rand, and every month you repay me a portion of the capital, like a home loan. So there is no amortizing schedule there. But I think what they're talking about, they just want to know what the terms of the loan are. So what I'm going to do on this slide quickly is just look at why would corporates consider a transformation fund grant versus, for example, an enterprise and supplier development solution, which we offer, which is an interest-free loan. So all of our clients make an interest-free loan to us. And you've already seen that the amendments introduce the transformation grant with 100% recognition. I'm just going to get my pointer out here at the bottom. Sorry. Okay, so there's 100% recognition. An interest-free loan has a 70% recognition, and I'll explain how that works. You can assume that the term is 5 years. You can assume that this company has a net PAT of 10 million Rand, an annual growth, 100 million Rand. That's missing a zero. You can see here it's 100 million Rand, an annual growth of 6%. So you can see it goes from 100 to 106, and it's compounded. So 112 and 119, 126. And you can assume that the loan remains a balance sheet in year 5. Okay, so what we're looking at in this, so here's the net PAT, and you can see that this is the growth line, 6%, and you can see that the contribution required is 3% in both instances. So you get either 3% by way of a loan or 3% by way of a grant. Now, for the transformation fund, it's an annual grant. So you can see in the first year they have to pay a grant of 3 million Rand, in the second year 3.1 because it's based off 106, in the third year 3.3, in the fourth year 3.7, 5 and 3.7, and over the 5 years they will have made a grant of, call it 17 million Rand. Okay, this is an income statement expense. Now, with an interest-free loan, it only has a recognition factor of 70. So in order for you to get 3 million Rands worth of exposure, you need to make an investment of 4.2, because 4.2 times 7 is 3. Okay, so your actual the recognition value is determined by what the recognition factor is. So if you times 4.285 by 70%, you'll get to 3 million. So that makes those two. So in the first year, the cash flow is much worse because you have to put more into the loan than you do to the grant, because your recognition factor is 100% for the grant and only 70% for the loan. But in the second year, whatever you have from the first year is already, the loan is in existence and you're entitled to recognize it. So all you have to do is top up the growth. So all I've done is I've taken 3% of the growth of 180,000 and divided by 0.7, and that's 257. So my loan grows from 4.2 to about 5.3, and it grows the next year a little bit more, grows the next year a little bit more. And by the end of the 5 years, my clients or an investor into an interest-free loan will have an interest-free balance sheet asset of 5.4 million Rand, right? Now, from a cash flow perspective, the transformation fund will have paid 17 million Rand, and that will have run through the income statement. From a cash flow point of view, they will have spent 11 million Rand, 11.5 million Rand more. And this balance sheet asset is an asset. As long as there's no defaults, which, we have a very, very low default ratio. But I mean, most enterprise and supply development funds are well run with I would say, even if you took the NEF, let's take the NEF, their fund, they've had a 50% loss. Let's assume that this was impaired by 50%. So you only got, we'll call it 2.7 million Rand back. You would have an asset of 2.7 versus having an expense of 16.9 over that term. So you will have spent 2.7 million versus 16.9. So the difference between the two is massive. I'm just going to get out of this pointer. So looking now, sorry, maybe the closing remark on this slide is it's very difficult for me to see how any of our investors would consider a transformation grant, because they would have to make that every year versus making a once-off investment with us and topping it up if their net profit grows. So that's our takeaway. Okay. Now, because we are involved in this market and we are interested in making sure that there is enterprise and supply development, these are the changes we have actually suggested in our submission to the DTI on the proposed changes. The EME and QSE thresholds, which I mentioned earlier on, so that these are turnover thresholds. An EME is 10 million and a QSE turnover threshold is 50 million. Were floated originally in 2014 and promulgated in 2016. If you take revenue inflation growth, so the global accepted revenue inflation is 2.8% above inflation. So I've taken our inflation target, I think of 3%, I've added another 3% on top of it, and I took the actual inflation from 2014 when these were originally discussed, and I've escalated it to 2026, and I've said the 10 million should at least be 25 million and the 50 should at least be 125. That would make it much easier for us to lend because the businesses have grown, and that it makes, it's bigger businesses that we can lend to, that any enterprise and supply development beneficiary can become. I've mentioned this many times, the 51% ownership. So in the codes, for some reason, the original codes had majority black ownership, and then someone, I don't know who, and this person, honestly, someone should really have a long chat to them. Majority black ownership is 50% plus one vote, not 51%. But anyway, it's hard-coded in the codes. It should be changed. Job creation is a national priority. They should retain increased bonus points. So the bonus points have increased to 2 points from current job creation 1 point. And they should provide incentives for youth jobs, more than 10% increase in jobs. So what we're saying is it's a good idea that they've increased the bonus points from they're suggesting an increase from 1 point to 2, but rather, instead of making it very complex to make jobs, they should rather say, okay, any job is 1 point, but if you make a job for youths, then you get an additional point. Or if you increase the number of jobs by 10%, then you get a second point. We think in the enterprise and supply development space, like in phase, that management fees should be disclosed and possibly capped. Initial fees should be capped at 1 or 2% if you're making loans or investments. Early repayment fees should be capped or prohibited. Performance fees should be prohibited or discouraged. The current benefit factor matrix for low interest loans is illogical and graduated. I won't get into this with you, but if you go and look at how an interest-bearing, a low-interest loan, and an interest-free loan works, you'll see that there's a problem with it. It drops. The recognition factor drops off a cliff when it goes from a very, very low interest loan to no interest, and it just doesn't make sense. Interest rates in excess of prime should be subject to a negative incentive. So currently, one of the contributions is an interest-bearing loan, but there's no cap on that interest-bearing loan. And so what we're saying is, look, the maximum rate there should be an agreement on the maximum rate for enterprise and supply development for an interest-bearing loan. But if you want to charge more than that, then you shouldn't get the recognition. It should start to penalize you. Specific attention should be paid to convertible debt or debt equity deals in which equity is acquired off the back of cheap or expensive debt. So when you are able to offer funding to a company, that company typically is in a weak bargaining position. And what we're saying is that some enterprise and supply development, including, I think, the NEF and the DTI, etc., often offer enterprise or supply development funding, but then want large, cheap equity stakes. And I think that needs to be looked at. Investments into ESD funds must be subject to standardized annual certification issued in an agreed format. There's nothing in the codes that talk about how businesses like Inyosi operate. And verification agents should be allowed to rely on a competent person's report and annual certificate issued to enterprise and supply development funds. So it's just trying to clean up and provide a little bit more context. And My conclusion, the proposed amendments have far-reaching implications that apply to the general codes only. There are no sector-specific codes. The DTIC is conflicted. They enforce the regulations via SANES. They offer an ESD fund under the NEF, and now they want to create a monopolistic transformation fund. They're both judge, jury, and executioner. Transformation Fund document expressly relies on the 2022B Commission study. Study is outdated. It is not granular. It does not split public and private data. It does not lay any rational basis for the Transformation Fund. It is outdated and specifically warns against relying on its data. Proposed amendments do not support the objectives of the Transformation Fund proposal. So they've set out what the objectives are, and then they specifically bypass them. The changes to preferential procurement are likely to result in a significant reduction in points for measured entities. The Transformation Fund is grant-based only. It will result in a 3% annual tax. This compares very unfavorably to interest-free unsecured loans, which enjoy an annual rating of 70% of the outstanding loan balance for as long as the loan is outstanding. There's little to no transparency relating to how Transformation Fund will be managed. There are already existing public sector funds like the NEF. Why is a special Transformation Fund even needed? Why is a grant to the Transformation Fund entitled to its own 20 points? It doesn't have to comply with enterprise supply development, and it has no accountability. That seems almost inexplicable in itself. There is no transition. So this is a key aspect. The codes, these proposed changes have no transition period. Now, the most recent code that came in was the legal sector code. It also didn't have a transition period, and it was immediately subject to attack from within the legal sector, and eventually they introduced a transition period. Most of the responses that I've seen to the proposals by the DTIC has suggested a 3-year transition period. The job creation bonus point is illogical. The needs analysis word salad is unworkable. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope that I haven't bored all of you or any of you.
Thanks so much, Evan. No, I definitely don't think so. Based on the commentary we're seeing coming through in the chat, I think it's been hugely informative. I know that there is some questions from ourselves, but there is a specific query in the chat regarding how this impacts on the ongoing development of the financial sector code.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I had a lot of debate with a number of verification agents because this is obviously something that we are firmly in the middle of. We're an enterprise supply development fund and the Transformation Fund. So in a way, I'm talking my own book, but the Transformation Fund is an alternative to what we do. That obviously I looked at this very carefully, and I encouraged our investors and verification agents to respond to the proposed changes. And I surprisingly had quite a few verification agents coming back to me and saying, look, my clients in the construction sector, this is generic codes only, it doesn't affect them, etc., which is correct. Technically, it's 100% correct. I do think that these changes, once implemented in the generic codes, the DTI will try and move as swiftly as possible to get these implemented in the other codes. It's not when you talk to different verification agents, they will tell you that, yes, I know that, but the transport sector has been trying for the last 8 years to publish their codes and they haven't succeeded. So yes, it might take time, but if I look at I'm careful. I am talking my own book. It is an area that deeply affects us. And so I am concerned about these changes specifically from our perspective. But I think I'm relatively objective enough to say that these changes appear to be being pushed quite hard with a very specific outcome. And that specific outcome to me is a transformation fund which is opaque and to which an easy contribution can be made, seemingly, if you're prepared to make an annual grant. And then what happens to that money, no one really knows. Okay, so because there's no requirement there's no one linking you to enterprise and supply development behind the scenes. And so that if you look at what's happened with the GNU and government and the ability for government officials to access ready sources of capital, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I just happen to be watching, like everyone else, with horror what's happening at the Malanga Commission and all other commissions that we've seen. It does look to me like there's a lot of urgency in getting this up and running. And if you read the drafting, even the drafting is so poor that job creation, if you understand that job creation is granted on an annual basis, it's impossible. It just doesn't make sense to have a 3-year average. It cannot work. It mathematically, logically, it just can't work. So you're forced to try and think, like, God, if that's what they're doing, what is the end game? So I would be cautious in thinking that because you fall under a sector code, you will be inured or not affected by this in the medium term. In the short term, absolutely, it's going to affect general code compliance. But in the medium to long term, there will be a lot of pressure. If it is successful in the general codes, there will be a lot of pressure to align the other codes, sectoral codes, with this.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's a very comprehensive response and much appreciated. Thank you. I know there was also a question about our FIA submission, and we've just included that feedback in the Q&A. So I'm going to hand over to Brad, who also has some additional questions for us that I think would be useful for our members. Thanks. Over to you, Brad.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Evan. Just to again, before I get into my question, just to reassure members, in short, the Financial Sector Code is our law for now. However, like Evan correctly stated, these draft amendments will serve as a roadmap for changes that will be likely renegotiated within our sector code later on the lines. So they do not change our current compliance requirements today, but serve as a roadmap going forward. So Evan, just a quick one. We obviously have been discussing the proposed amendments largely from the perspective of the concerns and changes they present. But being the forever optimist, I'm going to flip the script for a moment. For FIA members who are 100% Black-owned EMEs, that's exempted micro enterprises under the Financial Sector Code, obviously those entities automatically qualify as level 1 contributors. Could these proposed changes actually translate into some sort of meaningful commercial opportunity for our members? And if so, how should those members start really thinking about repositioning themselves to take advantage of what's coming up?
So as I mentioned, the most likely beneficiaries of this would be smaller businesses where you are likely to have a concentrated shareholding. And so 100% Black ownership or Black female is a real opportunity. If it were me, I'd focus on, I would try and ensure that my ownership were 100% Black female, because then you get 100% Black female procurement, you get 100% Black ownership procurement. So to the extent to which that is possible, and that's the obvious low-hanging fruit for those businesses.
Excellent.
And as I mentioned as well, there's an additional benefit that you pick up a 3-year contract. So if I were going to go about this, it's a really good point that you make, Brad. What I would do is I would wait for the amendments, then I would approach a corporate and say, look, I'm a short-term advisory business. I can help you with your insurance, but first, bring me on as a enterprise development beneficiary. In other words, I'm not supplying to you. We sign an enterprise development agreement, and I need a 500,000 Rand loan or to buy a printer, and I need a couple of computers, whatever that thing is, right? So you get that in place. And then you go and say, right, now that I'm an enterprise development beneficiary, give me a 3-year contract to do your short-term insurance, and you can graduate me. You'll get that benefit, and then you're getting a 3-year runway with them to provide those kind of services, and they get the procurement for 3 years, etc. So that's the way I would approach it.
Fully aligned. Thank you, Evan. I think what I take away from that is be proactive, start the work now, start those discussions now to capacitate yourself to ultimately, hopefully, be beneficiaries of these proposed amendments. Obviously, if it's within the scope of your business. I'm going to be
it's
a
like
bit
golf, right? It's like golf. Every shot pleases someone.
Exactly. I just think we just need to have perseverance and patience. So I'm going to be a bit spicy now. In terms of your idea of your understanding of the most contentious proposals of the amendments currently on the table, which do you believe carries the greatest risk for the financial intermediary sector if implemented in the current form that they are, and why?
I think you have to divide the risk into financial or compliance. I think from a financial point of view, if there are not many businesses, certainly if you look around and with the cost of diesel and all of the issues that we're facing at the moment, there are not many businesses that can afford to make a 3% contribution every year. So, I do think that one of the concerns I have is that because the DTI is drafting this, they are positioning the NEF as the manager of this, and they have SANAS who will go and enforce the regulations on the competing offerings. I am very concerned that they are going to try and put a huge amount of pressure onto the competitor landscape, and that may result in companies being forced to go the transformation route. And there are not many companies who can afford a 3% additional tax a year, and that's what that amounts to. So that's. But if you then think that your BE scorecard is a massively important aspect of your business, okay? Because if otherwise, there's almost no point in answering this question. So let's assume that the financial intermediary absolutely requires whatever level they're currently on, and that they are required to do enterprise supply and preferential procurement. I think the bigger impact actually is preferential procurement, because the 3% is a decision. I just earn less money. I hate the fact that I have to pay it away, but I just make peace with that. And maybe I load my prices with it. But if you can't do the procurement because there aren't the suppliers available, or for whatever reason you aren't able to meet the new procurement thresholds, some of the feedback I've had from verification agents is that the downgrading of score is anywhere from 2 to 3 points as a minimum. So if you're at a level 5, you're going to go to a level 8. If you're anything below a level 5, you're going to drop to non-compliant.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't have articulated it better. I think just one more question from my side in terms of the impact of the proposed amendments on our larger corporate members. These are essentially your QSFIs and institutional broker firms who are more directly exposed to these obligations, including employment equity targets. Where do you anticipate, Evan, the greatest compliance burden arising from these amendments, again, for our larger corporate members? Or do you think it's pretty much the same?
Preferential procurement is going to be a big issue. I know it's not an area we actively involved in, but obviously because we've got corporate clients, when we're busy with their verification and helping them and stuff, we hear the collateral damage that's going around and trying to keep track of preferential procurement. So I think that's a massive issue. And then, in reality, if you look at a corporate and how they and specifically South African corporates and all the issues we're dealing with, and I suppose globally the people are in a similar position, but South Africa has got there's a lot of noise that South African corporates deal with. This introduces another significant level of noise into the system. It's, as I said, these are massive changes, and there isn't even a transition period. There's no transition period. It just defies imagination that. So there is a chance that the DTIC comes back after all the submissions and says, we've heard everything you've said, but this is it. We've given you time to review it. We think it's fair, and they publish it with no transition. That is going to be an enormous burden to businesses out there who then have to run around and try and figure out whether to fight it, whether to stick with it, whether to just dump whatever they're going to do. So I do think that, there's that compliance burden is, I would say, if you do continue to comply, I suspect that the majority of the compliance, the transformation fund, they specifically designed to make as easy, just pay us the money and the bad man will go away. So from a compliance perspective, they appear to have made it very easy, although you still need a needs analysis, and the needs analysis is incompatible with a grant to the transformation fund because you don't know what the need is of the underlying beneficiary. But let's assume you can get through that. Transformation fund is easy, and preferential procurement will be an enormous obligation.
Thank you very much, Evan. Before I hand over to Samantha Williams, I think 3 ways within which members tongue-in-cheek could deal with this. Either put your headphones on and act like nothing's happening, put your seatbelt on and brace for it, or put your gloves on and get ready to do the work and prep. That's how I see it. Over to you, Samantha.
Oh, Samantha. Thanks, Brad, and for summing it up so succinctly. But Evan, I can't thank you enough for so clearly articulating these proposals to our members, the impacts on them, as well as also indicating what you'd included in your submission, what this means to members in the long run, and for so succinctly answering Brad's questions. We're so grateful for your time, your willingness to participate, and also just as a little precursor to the members, your indication earlier that you're very happy to join us at a future session to provide updates as this progresses to members. And I think those who've participated today
maybe you get a feedback from your members first.
No, I think this has been exceptionally well received. I think it has been incredibly useful. I think when we had discussed before, you'd raised concerns and said, yes, but the submission date has passed. And I was at pains to say, we understand that and we have made a submission, but I think for people to really get a proper and clear understanding of what this actually means from the experts is absolutely invaluable. And for those who didn't read and perhaps didn't look and weren't familiar, this just gives them insight into what they may have missed and what needs to be on their radar. So thank you so much on behalf of Brad and I. We really are truly grateful, and we will most certainly be in touch for any future updates that we may need. And just a reminder to everyone, this is CPD accredited. In a couple of days, your certificates will be available on the online portal. So once again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to engaging further. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you, members.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.